Just a few things that I want to cover. We have a few rules. A recording of this session will be available in 2 to 3 weeks. What happens is once we complete the webinar, we need to send it off to another team to have closed captioning. And then once the closed captioning has been added, we will add this webinar to the DC Network in the IRB Research Center page. The video and audio is disabled for participants since this is such a large group, with the exception of the webinar facilitators. The chat and hand raise feature has been disabled. We will be asking that you save your questions till the end. We'll be answering all of your questions, or as many as we possibly can, at the conclusion of the presentation. Please ask questions that are relevant to today's webinar topic. We will not be addressing any personal questions regarding class scheduling and things of that nature, only things relevant to today's subject. And IRB contact information will be provided at the end of the presentation. So today is Thursday, July 9th. And my name is Latrice Smith. I am the IRB administrator, and I'm joined today by the IRB director, Dr. Cynthia Bainbridge. Also joined by research faculty manager and the IRB reviewer, Dr. Linda Garrett. Program and project manager, Catlina. And last but not least, our two co-hosts for today's webinar, and highly esteemed IRB reviewers and also dissertation chairs, Dr. Linnea Redmaker and Dr. Twyla Williams-Damon. Dr. Williams-Damon and Dr. Redmaker will be presenting today's topics in 2 sections. The first section will review screening questions versus demographic questions and what's the difference. And the second part of the presentation will review alignment in your IRB application, clarifying your eligibility criteria, and clarifying your research activities. We will go through both sections and answer questions at the end. So please be sure to write your questions down as we go through the presentation. So without further ado, I will turn the presentation over to Dr. Williams-Damon.
Hello, you can go to the next slide, please. And the next one. Hello, I am Dr. Twyla Williams-Damon, and I will be presenting the first part of this webinar. As Latrice said, I will be going over the definition of screening questions, the definition of demographic questions, the differences between the two, and the sequencing of these 2 types of questions considering the informed consent. The reason why we are doing this particular topic is because it seems to be a current topic of discussion among both chairs and students, and sometimes a topic of confusion. So in order to clarify these differences and to give some answers to some of the packages that we are receiving that are reflecting this confusion, we are going to give this clarifying information today. Next slide, please. Okay, when you are looking first at the screening questions and demographic questions, in a first initial review, we need to understand that all questions are not created equally. And that means that screening questions and demographic questions are not the same. And oftentimes they are viewed as being the same, but they are not. So when you are first looking at these questions, one way of being able to decipher the difference initially is that screening questions are required. These are questions that the participants must answer in order to be in the study or to determine whether they can be in the study. So they are a requirement. And then demographic questions, on the other hand, are optional. Some studies do not even have demographic questions, and sometimes researchers will give the option of whether the participant can answer or not these particular questions. So screening questions are required, demographic questions are optional. Next slide, please. So in reference to that, what are screening questions actually? Well, screening questions are those that you are going to ask your potential participants, and they are going to be able to determine whether they are eligible or not to participate in your study. It needs to be very clear as to whether they fit into your population or sample that you are trying to get for your study. So we ask the question, okay, well then do we need a screening questionnaire? And the answer is no, not necessarily, because the screening the screening question should be part of your recruitment when you are speaking to your inclusion and exclusion criteria. Okay, so if you do have a screening questionnaire, and if you look at the inclusion and exclusion criteria, those questions should be embedded within that already. Again, for the participants to be able to know whether they qualify or do not qualify for the study. Another characteristic of screening questions is that they are asked before the informed consent. And this is another way to be able to decipher between the two. You must ask screening questions before an informed consent is signed or acknowledged. Again, because the participant needs to be very clear on whether they can qualify or not qualify to be in your study. And lastly, when we're looking at screening questions, more oftentimes than not, the answers to those questions are either yes or no. They're just very, very point blank. Either you qualify or either you don't. Okay, next slide. So in contrast to that, when we're talking about demographic questions, it's a little bit different. Demographic questions, first of all, are asked after the informed consent has been signed or acknowledged. So that's one big difference here. Screening before, demographics are after. So if that's the case, then it doesn't make sense for us to be able to use those as screening tools or as screening questions. So demographic questions are not the same. They're not to be used as screening tools, and they are to be asked after the informed consent is actually signed. Oftentimes we see packages where screening questions are just copy and pasted into demographic questions. And from what I just explained, you can see why that is not appropriate for our packages. So again, we need to remind our researchers that you cannot ask these demographic questions until your participants have agreed to do so. So when we're talking about demographics, another way that we can determine our demographic questions is to ask ourselves, does this demographic question tie to the focus of my research? And does this demographic question tie and answer one or more of my research questions? And if that is not the case, we need to do some other things to be able to include those particular questions. However, when you're initially narrating those demographics, they need to in some way be able to be tied to your study. Next slide, please. So what do these differences look like? This is basically a compare and contrast of what screening questions would look like versus what demographic questions would look like. So if you look in the first box, you will see that every last one of these questions can be answered with a yes or a no. And they are basically directly tied to what you need your population or your sample to look like. So these would be examples of screening questions. And on the other hand, in the blue box, we see demographics, and these questions cannot be answered with yes or no. Actually, there are several answers that are available for all of them. But we also need to be mindful as to whether these particular questions, again, tie to our research or to our research questions. Next slide. So a picture is worth 1,000 words. So this is an order of operations of what that would look like. So screening or recruitment questions would come before the informed consent, and then after the informed consent, you would then ask demographic questions, okay? And I often get questions, okay, well, where does the survey or questionnaire come into play? It comes into play after your demographic questions more oftentimes than not. With the current situation with COVID, we know that most studies are either going virtually or online, and we need to also remind students that that link to the survey or the questionnaire, the first page of that needs to consider the informed consent, And then from there, once the participant agrees or acknowledges the informed consent, then they are brought into the demographic questions and then into the actual survey. Next slide, please. So why does this matter? What's the big deal? Well, there's a couple of reasons why it's a big deal. First of all, at GCU, we follow the common rule, the most recently published common rule for 2018, in which it says that we have to fully inform participants of what they are going to be required to do when we want them to be part of our studies. So first of all, that is one reason why it makes a difference. And second of all, when we think about the Belmont report, and we think about the three principles of respect for persons, beneficence, and justice, we have to also make those considerations in IRB. So when we talk about respect for persons, we need to ensure that we have given participants the ability to protect their privacy, to make the decisions as to whether they want to be in the study or not. And if that particular privacy is going to be diminished, we have to protect them. So in order to do that, we have to give them information and be very clear on what we plan to do. And when we talk about beneficence, it's a little bit different in the sense of we have that moral and ethical responsibility, again, to give them the information so that we can protect them if they choose or do not want to be involved in a study that's going to ask them questions that they were not prepared to answer in the beginning. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is where when a student decides that, okay, you've told me the difference between screening questions and demographic questions, but what if I still want to ask some questions that are personal or identifiable? And at IRB, we basically give you a choice. There's two things you can do. First of all, you can redo your demographic questions and only ask those that are directly related to your study. Okay, that's one way we can address this. And the second way is that you can ask those types of questions. However, you must outline those questions in the IRB application, in the recruitment materials, and in the informed consent. And you need to list all of these personal demographic questions that you intend to ask, because we do not want participants to go into a study and give their informed consent and then be bombarded with questions that they were not aware of that they would be asked, okay? So what would that look like? Well, the example that I give here would be one of your bullet points in your inclusion criteria. And this is just an example from a student. And it basically says, willing to answer personal demographic questions related to, for this student, it was age, level of education, gender, and marital status. So when the potential participant is looking at the recruitment, they can clearly see that to be included in this study or one of the activities that they will be asked to do is to answer these types of questions. And it's very clear up front. And again, they have the information to make a knowledgeable decision as to whether they want to be in the study or not. Okay, so this concludes my coverage of the first part of the webinar. And questions and answers, I will remind you, will be asked at the end. And from here, we will have Dr. Raidmaker go on to part 2.
Thank you, Dr. Damon. Thank you so much. Hello, everybody, and welcome to our webinar today. I am going to talk about alignment in the IRB application. Alignment is a word that you've all heard a lot in your dissertation studies as you work to align your topic and your problem and your purpose. And so we also have the same consideration in the IRB, and so that's what we're going to talk about today. Next slide, please. In the IRB application, when we talk about alignment, we're talking about looking at the 3 things that you create, specifically the application answers, your recruitment material for the participants, and your informed consent form that you use during the informed consent process for the participants. So we want those documents to align, in other words, be the same across. And so this is something that we see quite a bit when we're reviewing, and we thought that it would be helpful for us to show you what this means in this presentation this afternoon. Next slide, please. Okay, so when you apply to the IRB, as we said, you have several documents to include, but we're going to talk about, as you can see on this slide, the application, which is in the first green circle, the recruitment material, which is in the second green circle, and the third one, the informed consent, the third green circle. And so we want our eligibility criteria that Dr. Damon talked about. What do you need that describes your population and sample? What is the inclusive elements or factors of the people that you want to include in your study? Your eligibility criteria, inclusion and exclusion criteria, along with the research activities that you would like them to undertake. All of those things must be the same across these three documents, okay? Next slide, please. All right, so here's an example of alignment. So if my project title is a qualitative investigation of participants' perceptions of organizational change, my inclusion criteria might be adults over the age of 18, they work for the site organization, they're willing to answer demographic questions about their age, gender, length of time at the company, and their job title. These are my inclusion. There is no exclusion because everybody that fits that criteria is eligible to be in my study, whether it's the boss of the company or anyone else down the line. In my research activities, I have interviews via Zoom, 60 minutes, audio recorded, or we're going to talk about why these are highlighted later. Focus groups, 4 to 6 participants, 90 minutes via Zoom, audio, video recorded, and then a demographic questionnaire where I repeat what I just said up here. All participants have to take this 5 minutes online survey, providing information about their age, gender, length of time, and their job title. Remembering that all research activities in any study are always voluntary and optional. All right, let's go to the next slide and we'll keep going on this idea. All right, so if you look at your recruitment template, there is a place for inclusion and exclusion criteria or eligibility criteria. And so that should be here. You take it from your application and you put it here. And your informed consent template as well. And then the research activity should be mimicked. So it should be very simple and seamless. If you think about these things as aligning, those three documents, when you write it in the application, cut and paste it into your informed consent and into your recruitment material. And that way, that tells me that you're really thinking about alignment and you're going to be doing the same thing across the way, okay? Let's go to the next slide, please. So when we think about eligibility criteria, as we break this down a little bit, it's one of the most significant aspects of your application and participant-facing materials. When a participant reads that criteria, they should know immediately whether they qualify, which is what Dr. Damon was talking about before, about whether you need a screening questionnaire or not, which I often see those. You shouldn't. If you have this clear in your recruitment, in your application, and in your informed consent, they've seen it twice. I've seen it 3 times because you've written it at all 3 places, but they've seen it twice, okay? So they should know whether or not they are eligible, and those questions should be yes, no. So those were my examples. Do you work for Acme Corporation? Are you over the age of 18? And are you willing to answer these demographic questions that we've outlined? Next slide, please. Inclusion and exclusion criteria, again, they are attributes that the prospective participants must have. Sometimes people assume that exclusion criteria is just the opposite of inclusion, but that's not quite right. The inclusion criteria is how you describe, as we said, those included in your research population. But sometimes we have a population, for instance, if I only wanted employees of Acme Corporation, but not the owner, then my exclusion criteria would say, if you are the owner of this corporation, you are not eligible to participate in this study. All right, so that's part of the whole population of working for Acme Corporation, over the age of 18, but you're not eligible if you're the owner, okay? Another example would be if you want to interview teachers within a specific district. This might be relevant to those of you in education. And you might say any teacher within X district, And your exclusion criteria, if you didn't want to include administrators, because administrators were also teachers first and may also still be teachers. So if you don't want to include administrators, your exclusion criteria would be if you are an administrator, you are not eligible to participate in the study. And that way, that would help your reader know, oh, this isn't for me, this is for the other teachers in my building, okay? All right, let's go to the next slide, please. And this one is about research activities. So I've broken this down with a little graphic here to show you how this helps the reader know what you're asking them to do, all right? So the interviews via Zoom, 60 minutes, audio recorded, or the or tells them that they can do one or the other. If you say and, then they know that you want them to do both an interview and a focus group. Why is that important? Because it's their time that you're talking about, and they want to know how much time am I going to have to invest in helping you in your research study. So it is very important to have respect for that participant who's giving you their time to help you in your research. Demographic questionnaire, all participants. By saying all participants, that tells the reader that both the focus group people and the interview people are going to complete this demographic questionnaire. Okay, how long that will take and what kind of questions are going to be asked. So you give them the information about the activity, the time, the place, as much information as you can, clearly stated. I love bullets. I use bulleted information a lot. Very clearly stated, and so that the participant knows I'm eligible and I can do this. I can give 90 minutes of my time or 60 minutes of my time to this. Next slide, please. Okay, so now we are nearing the end of the presentation, but I just want to reiterate what this half was about, all right? This is about alignment. And I can't say this enough because it's really important that you don't introduce new ideas when you get to creating your informed consent. If you do the application first and you say one thing and then there's different material in your informed consent, or you've got different data collection instruments but you didn't reference them in either the recruitment or the informed consent, I need to know what you're doing and what you're asking participants to do so that the participants know what they're being asked to do. Okay, that ends my portion of the webinar.
Thank you to our presenters for covering two really great topics. I want to just remind everybody on the call, we've had lots of questions about when the presentation, if the PowerPoint will be available and when will the presentation be available. So we will get the PowerPoint slides posted up in the next day or so, or two, by Monday for sure at the latest. Then you'll be able to access the PowerPoint and review the information covered. Latrice had indicated at the beginning of the presentation that we send this recording off to our web services team here at Grand Canyon University, where they will close caption the presentation and send it back to us. And at that time, once we receive it back, we will post the presentation, the webinar presentation on the DC in the same location as the PowerPoint, so you'll be able to review our webinar presentation again. I know we covered a lot of information in a short period of time, so we really appreciate the fact that you're all here in attendance, and we know that you'll want to review it again. So it will be posted and we'll get it out there to you as soon as possible. For those of you that have raised hands, this is a one-way communication, unfortunately, because of our large group. So we have some questions in the Q&A, I think, that we can start to field at this time. And I know that some of you are posting in the chat. We would really need to have you post over into the Q&A because that's where we'll address those questions. So those of you that are posting questions in the chat, please repost them over in the Q&A and we'll try to address them as we go through those right now. So I'll turn it over to Linda and Latrice, and then I'll kind of get into the Q&A area as well, and we can hopefully start to address some of this, some of your questions.
Thank you, Dr.
Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Bainbridge. So the first question we have is, what is the process in using screening questions if the participants can only speak another language? So if you're going to be doing a study with participants that don't speak English and you need to put it in a second language, then you have to have your questions translated to their language, and they have to be certified by someone who is certified to translate. So you can't just translate them yourself unless you're certified.
Yes, and to add to that, once you complete your IRB application, it will be asking you to upload that information with the certified document information.
And as a follow-up, I know earlier on there was a question sort of related to the screening questions, and if they were in another language, if that would serve as an implied consent. And that, of course, is not the correct at all. Those screening questionnaires are, and that does not, indicate at all that they're consenting to participate in your study, right? Those are those screening items are intended to help you identify whether or not an individual would be eligible to participate in your study, and then you would move through, as Dr. Williams-Damon indicated, move through then the informed consent process with that individual. So working with individuals that are international, that require translation of all of your materials, it's a really important thing to consider in your study, and the logistics behind that, and then making sure that you get a certified translator to make sure that the information is translated properly. Okay.
Dr. Bainbridge, we should also remind them that we do have a form available on the IRB website specifically for that, where the translator can sign off and give their credentials.
Yes.
Great.
Another clarification I want to make sure that everyone understands is that you cannot present a screening questionnaire before IRB approval. The only thing that you can do before IRB approval is gain site approval. That's the only people that you can contact is for site approval. You should not be discussing your study with anyone else or any potential participants before gaining IRB approval. And we had a question about if using Skype, should the informed consent indicate audio and or video, or is it assumed that both will be used? In informed consent, nothing is assumed. You need to tell us exactly what you plan to do.
Exactly.
It needs to be, like Dr. Rademacher said, it needs to be perfectly clear to the participant what you're asking them to do.
And we do
how
have
you're asking them to
sections
do it.
on
Yeah.
the informed consent template that address that you have to include if you're using audio and video.
Okay.
There's another question. A recruitment letter that includes the informed consent is basically pre-qualifying the participants. So I think that person would like some clarification on that question.
There's a difference in recruitment and informed consent. Recruitment occurs before the informed consent. So the informed consent should not be a part of the recruitment itself. So I think that that's the first confusion there that I heard in that statement. So hopefully that clarifies. There's recruitment, and then there's informed consent once the participant decides they are eligible to participate or not.
Mm-hmm. And we have a template for both in the DC Network IRB Center.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. We had a question if we're using Zoom to complete surveys. My tools require, oops, somebody just took it away from me. If you're using Zoom, you can use Zoom to interview your participants. You want to make sure that on the informed consent form, you let them know that you're going to be using Zoom and that they have the option, if you're planning on a video and the audio recording, you need to let them know that so that they can make a decision on whether or not they want to be video recorded. And if they don't, then you have to let them know whether or not they need to be recorded in order to be in the study. That needs to be included in the informed consent form so that they can make a decision on whether or not they want to be recorded.
Okay, so the question, I did find the question, it asked, do I have to record? I was not planning to. So is recording something that's required?
Not by us.
Right, it's not required, but I would recommend it because if you're doing interviews, you're going to be getting a lot of information from someone in a short amount of time, and you're not going to be able to write all of that down or remember it all. And in order for your to put what you need in your dissertation to write those responses, you're going to need to be able to capture all the information that that they're saying.
Transcription, yeah. You can't do that without recording.
We have a question that Dr. Nafziger posted about, is the link to the most current IRB form clearly indicated on the IRB page in the DC network? So when you go to the DC network, the IRB Research Center, if you click on dissertation resources, and I'm going to I'll post the link right here in the chat and also in response to Dr. Nafziger. But right on the home page under dissertation resources, you'll see the link to the IRB Research Center. And then on that page, you will see a Connect to IRIS, which is where you submit your IRB application. But you also will see the really important 8 steps to preparing and submitting your IRB application. So go to the IRB Research Center. And like I said, I'm going to post it right here in the chat for you all. And go review all of the great resources that we have available for you, the training videos, the steps to submitting and preparing and submitting your IRB application. So there's a tremendous amount of really great resources there for you to review.
And I would like to add to that, do not use the search function in DC Network to find the forms, because you most likely will not get the latest version if you do it in the search. You should go to the IRB page, like Dr. Bainbridge said, and pull it. It's actually step 7 is where you'll see the forms and templates.
Cooper asked about having site authorization before the IRB application. Does somebody want to address that really quick?
You should have site authorization, even if your site is, a social media page that is open to all. Make sure that it's okay for you to post a recruitment. But if you're using resources that don't belong to you, such as a private social media group or a company to recruit and to collect data from your participants, then you need site authorization. And we have that. We have a letter template for that in the DC network and this place to upload it into your application package.
Students do need to be mindful, though, that those site authorizations are good for 1 year, so they do expire. So be mindful of the dates.
Yeah. We had a question about the specific if there's a specific minimum number of items that should be in the demographics, and you just want to keep in mind there's no minimum number, but you only want to ask questions that you need in order to answer your research questions and complete your study.
Okay. I just want to remind everyone, I see quite a bit of people posting questions in the chat. If you have questions that you'd like for us to review, please post them in the Q&A section.
We have a question and just a reminder for all of you about using Zoom and FaceTime or Skype or other video conferencing during the pandemic for your interviews. And we actually had a really great webinar last month specifically on this for options for data collection. So take some time and go review that webinar, which is on the IRB Research Center page. And that'll give you some really good guidelines around, data collection options. And certainly right now during this time, you definitely want to use an alternate data collection method as opposed to being in person if possible. So, you know, and if you do have in-person data collection, you really need to be looking at your local and state guidelines, and of course national guidelines on things that you know, the requirements for interacting with somebody in social distancing and masks and all of those things. But it certainly is, you know, we want to encourage you to really, you know, look towards a virtual option at this point for everybody's safety, right? So that's important. Again, take a gander or just take a look over at all of those resources and videos that we have available for you.
So
And those of you that have specific questions about your own studies, I think just because of how big the webinar is and how many questions we have, Latrice had mentioned earlier about our office hours every Wednesday morning, and please jump into an office hour session to get some of your more personal questions answered about your study. That's a really great place to get those questions answered, or post a question in the IRB forum.
Yes.
And I'd like to add on to that, DNP has office hours as well. So theirs, I think, is at 5 a.m. on Thursday mornings and Arizona time. And their information is on the DNP calendar. So if you're a DNP student and you have some questions related to your IRB application, please reach out to them during their office hours. Or they also have an email that you can submit to answer to ask your questions at any time.
Yeah, the DMP Zoom office hours has also been added to the CDS calendar as well, because we had a lot of questions about that. So you can also find the DMP Zoom office hours on the main events page. And another comment, someone made a comment that it was difficult to find the IRB Research Center page. So the easiest way to find it from the DC Network homepage is to go to the dissertation resources. On the left side of the page, click the drop down, and right under that, there is a link for IRB Research Center. That'll take you directly to our page.
Someone asked about timeline for IRB approval. And usually once you have your application materials submitted, it takes anywhere from 2 to 3 weeks generally to go through the review process and gain IRB approval.
We had a couple of questions about when to submit the application for IRB, when to start the IRB process. And there is a class that you're going to go through to complete the IRB forms and the application. You're not going to submit it until you receive AQR approval for your proposal.
Level 2.
So there's another question.
One that was similar to that, Linda, about Dr. Garrett, about when do we recommend learners start to learn about the IRB process? And I would say
Now.
because when you think about the IRB package, it's somewhat of a snapshot of Chapter 3. And you need to know exactly what you plan on doing, how you plan on doing it, and what parameters need to be in place to get that accomplished. So when you look at the IRB package and what you are going to be required to submit, it helps you be able to knowledgeably know what's going on and be able to relate to us what you plan to do. Because
Right,
that's the biggest thing for packages. We need to understand what is it that you plan to do, how, when, and why. And then we can determine from there whether the participants are protected or not.
That's a good point. And I would say you should start reading the information and reviewing the videos in the IRB Research Center now. There is a wealth of information there. There's a lot that you're going to have to go through. And the more that you're able to read and listen to the videos, the better off you'll be when it's time for you to start the process.
You do, and we have several questions about, is there a class for IRB, or is there additional opportunity to work on IRB or discuss that? So depending upon where you are in your program, you will be introduced to city training, and city training is our research ethics training, and there's two parts to it. There's a social behavioral research certificate, and you'll take courses or modules in that particular course related to conducting research in social behavioral science. And then also there is a course, responsible conduct of research, and that includes modules around conducting research. And so both of those classes contain, those modules or courses within city training contain some really great information that address a lot of the questions you're asking about IRB and some of the recruiting and the application process. And so you'll start that early on in your program and really pay attention to those and make sure you take advantage of all the great resources that are embedded within each of those modules. There's videos and sort of additional support material along with just the basic information. So you'll work on that early in the program. You'll also, for those of you that are perhaps doing residencies right now, we have a residency presentation that Latrice also and others within our IRB team present with some basic information about IRB and where to go find these resources that we're talking about. And then also in residency too, you'll spend some additional time thinking about some of these different topics that we're covering here in this particular presentation. And then also once you get into the dissertation phase of your program, there is an assignment in, I believe it's DIS 960, it's like your second dissertation course, where you're actually asked to draft up initial documents for your IRB. And that's an important assignment because you're starting to put things in draft format and work with, creating these recruiting documents or your informed consent and things like that in preparation for submitting to IRB. So you do have additional opportunity. And again, make sure that you go into the DC network to the IRB research center, because all of the templates, the documents, the steps for preparing your application videos, training videos, they're all there. And that's just the important thing. You just have to carve out some time to really learn about the IRB process and what's required, and then work with your chair specifically when you get to that point on some of the more specific questions about sequencing and what you need to include in your recruiting materials and in your informed consent and all of those things. But again, those resources are out there for you, and it's really important, since I have over 400 people still on the call, is that be a gatherer. We kind of view the DC network in two ways, as a hunter and a gatherer, and sometimes you just have to go in and find a specific document or template. But as a gatherer, you're going to go in and review resources and just spend time looking around on what's available. And in this, depending upon where you are in your program and what you're working on, be a gatherer and go get those resources and look at them and download them and spend time, because I think it'll help you a lot in terms of many of the questions that we're seeing pop up here in terms of your studies. And then, as I said, come to our IRB sessions that we have for office hours, and you'll find that very helpful as well. And if you've already taken a city training class, you can go right back into your city training and review those modules. So if you have any questions, that's something you can certainly do if you have any, if you'd like to go back and review some information. What other questions do we have?
There's one question, and I think that this learner may be needs some clarification. So it says, would I be correct to assume if I am seeking IRB waiver, I still list my inclusion exclusion criteria for the data source I am using? So I'm guessing
not sure what an IRB waiver is.
that waiver.
If you're working with human participants, you must go through the IRB. Any study that's done with any human participants has to go through the IRB for many different reasons, and you'll learn a little bit about that in your city training. It's a federal guideline, and we have to abide by that. Maybe a waiver for the informed consent may have been.
Waiver of documentation of informed consent. That could be what they're talking about, but I can't tell until a waiver of documentation means that you still have the informed consent and you still have the informed consent process where you walk participants through what you're asking them to do, but then they don't have to sign it. For instance, if you're doing an anonymous online survey, the informed consent is still that first page of the survey, so that they can read through it and agree to participate or not. If they don't want to, then they disagree and are exited from your survey. Maybe that's what you mean.
I saw a question here about field tests a couple of times. Field tests, you should probably talk to your dissertation chair to clarify that further. You do not need IRB approval for a field test, and that should be occurring before you go to level 2. So I would talk to your chair about that particular item as far as the field test is concerned.
So we have I think, a good question. I'm going to just put this up. What is the aim of the IRB?
Protecting human participants.
Participants, to protect them according to federal mandates.
Right. So the Institutional Review Board, every organization, every university has an institutional review board. And the intent of that is to ensure that there is ethical conduct of research, that we're protecting our research participants in our studies, and that we're complying with federal regulations and guidelines around the research that we do here at GCU. And essentially it becomes a bit of an oversight body for the institution in terms of the research activities for the university or the organization. So school districts now often will have their own institutional review board. Universities, of course, as I mentioned, all have an institutional review board. In fact, they'll have multiple boards depending upon the disciplines. And now organizations will also, some organizations also have developed their own institutional review boards. Research is becoming more and more prevalent in how we protect our subjects, and the data that we're collecting from these subjects is becoming increasingly important, as you probably are all aware, given how reliant we are in terms of being online and using the internet and accessing data breaches and things like that. So our role is to make sure you're protected as a researcher under the umbrella of Grand Canyon University, and that your research study is following all the guidelines and protocols that are outlined by federal regulators, and that we also, most importantly, are protecting those individuals that are being part of our research studies here at GCU. So that's it. I mean, it's a great question, and I really appreciate you all bringing that up. All right.
So there's a question. I'm not sure if we've reviewed this one. If recruiting for interviews from a wide spectrum, in parentheses, essential workers, is there a format that works best and is authorized versus, what is authorization maybe, versus site authorization?
Oh, they are probably asking if they can do it without needing site authorization. Yeah, so if you're recruiting essential workers, a lot of workers are categorized as essential workers. So make sure that you have a clear eligibility criteria of which essential workers that you are recruiting. Are they in healthcare? Are they in law enforcement? Are they in retail, considered essential workers? So make sure you know what that is. And if you don't have any other categories than that, you might consider specific organizations, or you might consider specific social media sites, such as LinkedIn or Facebook groups. I'm sure there are others, but consider those and check with those groups to see if they would allow you to post, and sometimes they'll just give you a little email that you can take a snapshot of and upload that as site authorization. If you're recruiting from a hospital, obviously that's a little more complicated because hospitals usually have IRBs as well, because a lot of medical research is usually conducted in hospitals. So you want to check out the sites that you want and be a little bit more specific on your focus before we could answer that question really well.
We've had a couple questions occur or come up about when do you submit for IRB? And so this is an important question. So number one, go to the IRB Research Center page because it will provide you lots of information. Also, those of you that are kind of beginning this process and trying to figure out what's going to happen during your dissertation, the dissertation milestone guide, that's also located on the DC network under, if you go to that dissertation resource page and go to dissertation homepage, right? Go click on that, you'll see all of our dissertation templates, you'll see the milestone guide, you'll see a bunch of research resources that will help you. So, you know, just make sure you go carefully review that dissertation milestone guide because it helps you not only understand the sequence of moving through your dissertation research process, but it also is very important in terms of project planning, right? And helping you understand sort of when you need to be thinking about you're going to hit this milestone or level 2 review. So just the quick answer to that, and I could just say is, well, you submit to IRB after level 2 proposal, review, and approval. You might not know what that means, so go to the dissertation milestone guide and take a look at that and really get an understanding of what the steps and process you know, is for each of those major milestones that you need to hit. And so IRB approval is one of those major milestones, and there's a lot of great information in the milestone guide to help you as well. Another question, I see lots of questions around demographics and like, is there, can you, and maybe our reviewers want to jump in on this, I'll just pose it out there. But one question came up about, you know, can you collect unlimited demographic information? So I'll hand that over to our reviewers to address.
What unlimited means, but I'll go back to what I said earlier, that demographic information needs to be directly tied to the focus of the study or to answering the research questions. And if it does not, then they have to make that very clear in the inclusion criteria, in the recruitment criteria, that you will be asking those types of questions. But keep in mind, if you have a long list of questions that aren't tied to your research and you put that in the inclusion criteria, it will probably have some effect on your recruitment. So you need to think about that, you know.
The more demographics that you have, the more identifiable a participant is. And so, you know, when you're asking about gender, ethnicity, marital status, family income, all of those things, and you're asking about a particular group of people in a particular town, in a particular company, they become much more identifiable, and people are going to, I don't want to answer that.
Yeah.
That's personal.
Affect your sample.
Mm-hmm. Okay, there's one more question that I want to address by an anonymous attendee. The question is, the university will not grant approval until I have IRB approval. How can I get something from GCU stating that I am doing research? So when an outside IRB, so let's say you're participating or you're planning to conduct a study at a site that has their own IRB, and they want GCU approval first before they provide you either approval or site authorization. What you want to do is gather all the information that you would need for your IRB application and include some type of statement. Usually it's an email with someone's contact information or something from that site stating that they need GCU approval first. Mm-hmm. What happens is you upload that document and include it with your IRB application, and then we will review your IRB application. Then what will happen is we can provide you a conditional approval, And the condition will be that you gain that site approval letter. All sites who deal with IRBs are familiar with the conditional approval letter. So you take the conditional approval letter from GCU's IRB, you get your authorization from your site or the IRB approval, and then you submit that back to GCU's IRB. And once we receive that document, then we can provide you official approval. And at that point, once everything is complete, then you can begin to collect data.
Yes, Latrice, that's a good point. I've actually seen several of those. And, you know, if there's no site authorization, I get concerned. But when I see an email trail back and forth between the learner and the site saying, yes, we'll review your packet once your GCU has provided IRB approval, then I'm okay. And I know, okay, I can go ahead and review it, and then we'll provide conditional approval.
Couple quick questions about city training. That the city training that you take is good for 5 years. And if your city training is expired, then you will need to go back in and take the refresher and update your city training. So, and I know we have some learners that are coming back in and have been away for a little bit. And if your city training is expired, and that's really important because when you submit to IRB, the system actually checks for your city training. It talks to our city training partners, and you won't be able to submit to IRB unless your city training is all current and up to date. Okay, so that's a really great question. Just remember that if you have city training, you've already taken it, it's good for 5 years. So just kind of think about that in context of when you actually finished it up, and then go from there.
Okay.
So it looks like it's, yeah.
Past 3. You can go ahead, Dr. Bainbridge.
It was getting fun, huh?
I know. Well, listen, we've had a great webinar, and you all have asked a lot of great questions. And the nice thing is that we capture all of your questions here in the chat. And our team is working on trying to develop some FAQs that will eventually get posted up in relation to all the webinars that we've had over the last few months. So we appreciate all the great questions, and we know we didn't get to everybody's questions. And so one of the things, really make sure that, you know, speak with your faculty member. If you don't have an assigned chair right now and you're in a class, you know, reach out to your faculty member if you have questions about IRB or site authorization or study feasibility issues. I mean, those faculty in your classes generally can answer questions. Again, go to the IRB Research Center. You can click on our IRB forum, ask a question there. You're welcome to attend the office hours. DMP learners, if you're out there, make sure you go to the DMP office hours because they can address those specific questions. We're really working hard to support all of you and help you through this kind of complicated process, which we know is a little bit scary to tackle. And so that's why we're holding these webinars on a fairly regular basis to make sure we're getting out as much information as we can about the process. And I would just want to thank our presenters, Dr. Radmacher and Dr. William Damon, for the presentation. We really appreciate you putting this together. And Latrice runs our webinars for us, so we appreciate that. And Dr. Garrett, and as well as Kat and myself being here to answer your questions. So again, you know, work with your instructors. Go to your chair if you have an assigned chair to kind of figure out some of these resources and what you need to do. And then hopefully we'll have another webinar here in August, and we'll come back to that webinar because it'll be another exciting IRB topic that we will cover. So with that, we'll close up the webinar and just want to thank everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Have a great rest of your evening, and please stay safe and healthy out there.